My name is Hines, and this is the Life of an Artist. I get asked all the time, how did you get started drawing? When did you start drawing? And the answer is always the same thing. When I was a little kid, I had trouble reading, and my dad pulled out one of his old Superman comic books, and he sat me down and we started reading. I just remember the pages and how cool the art was and how cool Superman was. He was doing all these things that like regular people didn't do. And so for me, my parents were really encouraging. They let me start buying like 90s X-Men, which was ridiculous artwork, but it was cool back then. And so I would sit down and I'd get my little scratch paper and my pencil, and I'd start drawing the panels, and I'd learn about form and people's, like how people stand and what their muscles look like when they're Superman, and that kind of thing. And so I would sit down and I would just start drawing, and I would draw whatever I saw, and most of the time it looked terrible. But my parents were always really encouraging. There was one time where my mom pulled out this old art desk and she set it up in the living room for me, and she gave me paper and pens and colored pencils and whatever we had, and I would just sit down and draw for hours, and I loved it. So then from there I just started drawing whatever came to mind, whatever I wanted to, and got really excited about things and learned how to paint, and I learned how to draw and create shape and how to change things and edit things, and from there art just kind of took off. And most people would probably call me an illustrator. An illustrator is somebody that tells stories with their artwork, not necessarily just painting things, but they're creating stories visually. And it's probably pretty true about what I do, but most of the time I just think of myself as a dreamer. I go into this world and this place where things exist that nobody's ever seen before, like bunnies with swords and meerkats that ride on deer and Giranook. And I go to the zoo with my son sometimes, and I just look at these animals like, man, that is so cool. What would that look like if? And then I just fill in the blank. What does if look like? Well, what if is a rhinoceros that has tank armor? One of my favorite artists is a guy named James Gurney, and one time in a lecture I saw him speak, and he said, you have to keep seeing what's not there. You have to keep seeing the unseen. And that really stuck with me. I just started, in my sketchbooks and in my journals, I would start writing down things. I had this little black journal, and one time I was just writing things down, and I wrote down the word bunnies, and I thought, man, that is ridiculous. Like, what would I do with bunnies? Bunnies are these like silly things. And for the last 6 months to a year, that's probably all I've done, is draw bunnies with swords and spears and armor, and bunnies fighting snakes and bunnies fighting wolves. And it was this thing that I never expected. It was a story I never expected to tell. Yet here I am. It's what I'm doing right now. I love it. And it's taken a really long time to get a process as an artist for how I create my illustrations, how I create my drawings. A lot of experimenting, and a lot of what does it look like if I work with acrylic paint, or what does it look like if I work with colored pencil. And everything for me always starts in a sketchbook. I get these ideas, and I'll sit down and I'll just start drawing stuff, and most of the time it doesn't make sense, or sometimes it's awesome and I'll put a star by it because I want to do that again. And, this little drawing of this guy here kind of turned into a piece that took off in what I'm working on now. And so what I do is I do a lot of sketching in my sketchbook, and I draw out these weird things, and I spend a lot of time just hanging out in that place, and then from there I draw it into my big project, whatever that board looks like, and I'll sketch it out and change shapes and move things around. And once I'm done there, I use these awesome little micron pens, and I'll ink everything, and inking everything kind of creates these individual spaces that make it really easy to go in and put color down. It kind of separates out everything, so I know where things are going, where certain colors are going. It allows me to create the darkest values using black, and this has become a real fun process to do the inking all by itself. And then when I'm there, I have different brushes and color and paint. I work in watercolor because watercolor, I think, is the funnest medium to work with. It's super fluid, and you can do a lot of things with it, and you can layer colors that you don't see in the real world because you can see them both at the same time. And so I work with these watercolor sets, and I start painting. Most of the time I paint my subjects first, just because I like to define them before I define the world around them. So I'll paint my knight, or I'll paint my bunny, or whatever it is I'm doing. And when he's finished and when he looks like what I want him to look like, I'll go in and paint the background. And, for me, most of the time my characters hang out in the forest. It's one of my favorite places in the world, with trees and rocks and streams and waterfalls, and I like to create that world around them. And I spent a lot of time studying just how to create a forest background because it was important to me and I wanted to do it well. So I spent a lot of time there and a lot of study, and so I combined those things with my characters, and then you put all that together and you have a finished illustration. If I had one piece of advice for students who are just starting out in the art world who, maybe you just like to draw or maybe you like to color, my one piece of advice would always be just go for it. Whatever you're passionate about, dive into that thing. Experiment, be willing to make mistakes. Just have fun. If you're not having fun, you're not doing something you love. And, at the end of every day when I look at my work, I always smile because I know I've created something that really came from my heart. It came from a place of real joy. And so if you love art and you want to go for it, then just have fun with it. Experiment and get out there and do what you love, because when you're doing what you love, it's never work. It's always fun.